Nice to be speaking at OSCON again. And nice, I don't know how many are still sitting here from the previous talk. There was a database talk, and I actually sell MongoDB and used to sell my SQL for a total of 7 years now. So I enjoyed the previous talk, but this is a very non-technical talk, which I also enjoy doing. And idea for this talk has come from my experience where often in these open source companies, the developers and technical guys often come from the open source world, have a very strong experience with open source and are quite passionate about it often. And then for some reason we hire the sales reps and managers, executives from traditional software companies, so they might have long experience with, in the database case, for example, Oracle and Sybase and Microsoft and so on. And they come to sell an open source database, and they don't necessarily even want to learn a lot about is there anything new or specific with this open source thing. They think it's just like selling like before. Until they come to the day where we have been working with a customer and everything was going fine, and we did a pilot, and everything worked well, and the database was much faster than the other database that we were competing against. And then the customer said, but your prices are quite high, so we decided we're not going to pay you for support. And then the sales guy, of course, is very frustrated because he has goals to meet. And typical reaction might be like, well, this is very wrong. We should have more closed source so that they cannot refuse to pay. And then the open source guys will go like, no, that's stupid. That will make things even worse. But the open source guys also don't know anything about sales, so they are not really capable of having an intelligent discussion and trying to help the sales guys. And I now have 7 years of experience working in pre-sales and some marketing roles. And I'd like to think I know something about open source. So my point of this talk is to try to bridge the gap. So actually I would like to ask, like, this is OSCON, so how many in the room are like technical people, more developers than sales? Okay, about half. This is exciting. So how many are sales rep or business managers or maybe marketing? Awesome. How nice of you to be here. So what do you sell?
I actually run the open source strategy office for the company.
Okay.
So I do marketing, I help the sales team.
Very good to have you here. What do you sell?
I'm in charge of the Spanish open source center
Ah,
the Spanish government.
good. For Spain has a lot of open source in government for a long time. Who is actually a sales rep? You are a little bit. Okay. Okay, so we have like business type, not an actual sales rep, but that's fine. So pretty even distribution there. Oh, I should mention, I long time ago wrote a book called Open Life, The Philosophy of Open Source, which has a discussion on various open source business model that existed at the time, almost 10 years ago. You can find it on openlife.cc. You can also find this presentation from presentations.openlife.cc. So, okay, with that in mind, I want to kind of address both halves of the audience. So at first we're going to talk about basic sales stuff, like a sales funnel, how a sales process works. So that if you are like this techie guy, maybe you start your own company or you're working in a company who hires salespeople, you will be able to have an intelligent discussion with them how to sell open source, and then we will talk to the guys who know about sales at what I think is specific about selling open source software. So this is, can you see this well? Yeah? Can you see the text in the back? Okay, good, let's go. So a sales process is often modeled as a funnel, so it starts with kind of marketing, creating awareness, and adoption. So in open source, people download your software and start using it. And then you kind of try to contact those people. They become leads and qualified leads and ultimately customers. So each step, of course, kind of feeds into the other, so that to the right step is always a subset of the people on the left. Just in case this is new terminology to somebody, so awareness, of course, is what marketing departments do. But we should also remember, actually, many open source projects have been very popular and had a lot of awareness without really ever having commercial marketing, such as Perl, for example, and Drupal for the first 10 years. Then we actually have a blend of both of those. So companies now want to do community marketing. So you kind of want to play with these organic levers that we know very well from open source community, but it's actually like active marketing done by a vendor. So that's a very interesting topic. Adoption, this is an important step. So it means somebody is using your product. And of course, that's a necessary condition for them perhaps also paying for that product. So this was an important step to get to. So then when we start to talk about sales, the first thing we talk about is lead. So basically this is just some person who might become a customer, and we have some contact information about this person, maybe a phone number or an email. It means we can start contacting them and talk about whether they would like to buy something. So now if we combine with the previous steps, it means we have a person who is aware of our product, maybe using it already, and we are aware of them existing. So this is a good start for a sales process. But then we separate something that is called a qualified lead. And there are various ways you can qualify leads. But here I want to use something simple, which I've seen used quite a lot, which we call bunt qualified leads, which means the sales rep has discussed with this lead and verified that 4 conditions are true. At the customer, there exists a budget, because if there is no budget, they will not be able to pay you. The person has authority to spend money from the budget, maybe even sign the contract. There is a need for your product, right? So we are not just talking. There is a need to buy your product, and there is an actual timeline. So, before Black Friday in November, this has to be in production. So we need to conclude the negotiations before them. If there is no timeline, you can just talk forever without actually getting anywhere. So when I work as a pre-sales consultant, typically this is the point where I become engaged, because my time is kind of valuable, and often customers want help who wouldn't want free help from an expert. So typically once the sales rep has verified that you are a qualified lead, then we can talk about your actual technical issues and how we should do the project together, like a pilot project or something. And then a small, again, a subset of the qualified leads we successfully close deals with, and they can become paying customers. And actually, for a long time, people have identified a rule of thumb in open source that if you compare to the total population of users, you could expect that roughly 1 in 1,000 of your users might become paying customers. So, of course, this is a very round number because we don't know how many users we have anyway. So, but looking at number of downloads or some estimates, this is what open source companies have figured out more than 10 years ago already, and still believe it's true. Okay, that was basic sales process. So now when we talk about selling open source, we actually have kind of 2 different systems depending on which ecosystems we are in. Personally, I have experience with single vendor ecosystems where MySQL or MongoDB or some other company basically produces the product and is in control with it, and at least originally may not have any competition. Of course, there is competition against other databases, but not within that specific open source product. And then we have multi-vendor ecosystems like Linux, Hadoop, and OpenStack, where there is an additional step. So first, of course, you want the user to use your product because that's a precondition to him paying for it. But then you still need to compete against the other vendors in the same space, like the other Linux distributions, for example. So I will be mostly talking about the first variant because it's simpler, and that's where I have experience. Yes, please.
Sometimes you're competing with the DIY, people say.
Do it yourself. Yes, of course. So, and actually like 999 times out of 1,000 you are competing against, I will just support myself, I will do this myself, absolutely. And we will talk more about this. So a few words though, how these multi-vendor ecosystems would be different from what I will mostly be talking today. So it turns out, at least for the successful open source projects, these tend to be bigger. So you actually have a larger potential user base to sell into. So that's good, more potential customers. But then, of course, you might have other vendors competing for the same cake. So there is more competition. You might actually get a smaller piece of the cake. And then one thing is not related to sales, but of course, you have other vendors investing in the code. So you actually share the R&D cost. This can be very beneficial. For example, in Linux, I would say Red Hat is the leading Linux distribution for servers. But of the total work that goes into Linux, Red Hat does like 10%. So that's quite a good ratio if you can get a large share of the pie, but only pay for 10% of the work. And then, of course, there are others. I will talk now about the classic, like selling subscriptions and support and so on. There are variants, but more or less. This is the classic business model. And of course, there are other open source related models. So if you buy like an Android phone, a lot of the software is open source, but you wouldn't expect somebody to give you a free phone because of that. So the dynamics there are different. Same with a lot of like software as a service type of models. So if we go back to this funnel that we started with, now we understand how sales process works. So the question, of course, is how can we sell more? We want more money. So of course, an easy answer is that every step is a subset of the previous one. So by growing awareness, you might get more adoption, and then you might find more leads and so on, and that converts to more sales. But personally, I often think of this model in a simplified way that your revenue is a function of adoption times a conversion ratio. So conversion is conversion from free user to paying customer. And I like to focus on adoption because that is an act or a commitment from the users. So for example, you can have a great marketing department and create a lot of awareness. For example, I'm aware that there exist very nice Apple laptops and iPhones, but I have never actually used one. So this doesn't necessarily lead into sales for Apple in my case. But if somebody has actually started using your product, it's a good start for possibly getting them into a paying customer. All you need to do then is this conversion process, which we will talk about. So to increase your revenue, you can then increase either adoption or conversion ratio or both. So what can we do to increase conversion ratio? A number of things. If you go to some sales training, a very basic advice the trainer will or consultant will often start with is to say, well, have you thought about increasing your price? Maybe if you set a higher list price, your customer will actually pay more, and then you get more revenue. It's kind of obvious, but consultants can get a lot of money for giving you this advice. In open source, of course, we have to be very careful with churn. So if you increase prices, maybe some people will stop being customers. And in open source, this is, of course, very volatile because they can continue using the open source product and just stop paying you. But nevertheless, also with my employers, it has happened that we increased prices and then we got more money from the existing customers. So it's very good advice. I have highlighted a couple of ones here. So like I explained in the beginning, a lot of the sales reps and managers even who come to these companies and don't have a lot of open source experience think that, this is very bad. And when I was selling closed source, this was not a problem. So maybe if we add closed source features, so we have some kind of premium version that is not available as open source, that will force users to pay. And that is one thing that can help improve the conversion ratio for sure. But I think often these people overestimate how good it is. The problem is that, of course, the point with an open source business model is that your open source version has to be pretty good because people kind of like it and start using it. And so that means your premium version is not that compelling after all. Or if like more than half of your features are closed source, then probably you are in the wrong talk because it's not really an open source product anymore. So in a way, yes, this is one thing you can do, but often it's not as great as you would like to be. So even if you add closed source features, you will still have lots of users who say, well, that kind of works for us. We don't want to pay $500,000 to get like monitoring, because we can also download that from internet for free. The other thing that is important is you improve your lead qualification, right? So you're not actually changing price or anything with the product. You're just getting more efficient at actually selling. So if you consider that in this funnel from adoption to convert to the customer, 999 persons out of 1,000 are not paying. This is of course very important. You can't call 999 people just to close one deal. So you have to become very good at lead qualification and being very quick to maybe in an automated way even get rid of most of the people and identify those who will become good customers. So this is kind of an art, so I just want to tell you some heuristics that I use in lead qualification. By far the number one thing to look at is is your product being used in a mission critical setting. So with databases, for example, e-commerce is great. It means, especially if it's a global e-commerce site, so 24/7, somewhere in the world, somebody's always buying these products. So it means if the site goes down, somebody is losing money. Could be a lot of money if you're like Amazon. Every second they get money. And so that means they are likely to pay for support because it actually saves them money to have support. Think about that. Okay, another thing I often ask, because you talk with your customers, I often ask that, do you use like Oracle, IBM, or do you use Red Hat Enterprise? If they use other commercial software, maybe they are also likely to pay for my software. Sometimes customers have a policy or legal requirements. So if it's in production, we always buy support, period. Okay? Or actually, in my case, sometimes, not so often, but sometimes it happens, we have a policy against GPL or AGPL. So we want to pay for the commercial license, which some of these single vendors often are able to be offering. What else? One of my favorite is if a customer has very low competence, so you look at them like, this is a mess, these guys don't know anything what they're doing, they will have to buy support because otherwise they're in trouble. Unfortunately, they don't always do that. So sometimes they do, and that's great, but sometimes then they say that, and I have heard this so many times, we have so great engineers, we have decided we don't actually need support. And half a year later, they say, Henrik, can you come and help us because we deleted all of our data. And I have spent 17 hours on site getting data back for a customer that had done exactly that. It took so long that I think he had to buy milk for his children's morning cereal, but he couldn't find it 1 a.m. in the morning anymore. It was bad. So if we do all of these things to improve the conversion ratio, what can we achieve? So we start with this roughly 1 in 1,000 ratio. So I don't know, maybe we can double the conversion at best. If we can increase the price a lot, we can maybe do even better. But more or less, we cannot expect. Sometimes I hear product managers saying that we think that 1% or maybe even 10% of all our users should be paying us, because it's ridiculous that everybody's using it for free. That is nonsense. So no open source company ever has achieved such conversion ratios, and I doubt they never will. So be realistic. If you are in open source, this is kind of how the game works, right? So you can improve the conversion ratio a little bit, but most people will not pay. So of course we can then increase adoption. So we can do more marketing. We can improve the product. So remember, a lot of open source products never had any marketing and were very popular. So maybe if people are not using your product, it's because it's useless to them, right? If you are a small startup and you improve your product, and you have good momentum, it's completely possible that 2-3 years from now you will have 100 times more users than what you have today. On long term, maybe 1,000, you can grow 1,000 times in adoption. So clearly, increasing adoption is much more important than conversion ratio, although of course we want to be good at both. Metrics. I work in database performance, but in business we also want to have metrics. Why are metrics important? So this is a graph that I completely made up. It's not based on real numbers, but it does reflect things that I've seen happening in companies. Actually, this pattern is even more accentuated often in Europe if it's an American company and European sales comes later. So with an typical open source startup, you first start providing some code, put it on GitHub, people start using it. So you get a user base, and then if it goes well, you get more users, you can take investments and hire salespeople. So this means when your first salesperson is hired, you already have an existing user population. Probably some of them are already asking, we would like to buy support because we need help, blah, blah, blah. So you just call those and close your first deals. And you can hire more salespeople, and then you can sell even faster to the existing user base. So you get kind of exponential growth, or like the growth is a function of just hiring more salespeople to sell into the user population. And if you do like kind of the average manager would do, what they typically do is they look at last quarter's sales figures, and maybe there was 30% growth. They say, okay, next quarter we will add another 30%, or maybe next quarter we should grow faster, so let's add 50%. So they project future sales for the next year. The only problem is that then you reach a point where actually you have saturated the existing user base, and then your growth becomes a function not of hiring more salespeople, but a function of the growing adoption, which might be slower. So then if you don't understand how this works and you're just looking at your quarterly results and doing like a dumb projection, it might be that you just continue hiring more and more salespeople and you wonder why it's not working, and then you have more costs than revenue. So then you are in trouble. So how can we, now we understand that this is how our sales process actually works. How can we measure all of these things so that we can see how we advance in this process of a sales funnel? So of course, the ones to the right are kind of easy, and most companies do this very well because you do it also outside of open source in the same way. So in your customer relationship management software, of course you first you know how much money is coming in. Every business knows how to count that, but you typically also have a database of leads, so you can count the number of leads in the database, and if you have more leads now than you had half a year ago, that's good. Same for qualified leads. So you just print a report out of Salesforce and you have these numbers. How do you measure adoption? So I don't know. In open source, this is the eternal question. How many users do we have? We have no idea. Especially if your software is in the Linux distributions, people get it from there, and you cannot see the number of downloads on your site. But anyway, we can have proxy measures like downloads. I will show a graph with some LinkedIn analysis and so on. And same with awareness, so you can kind of pay for these services that count press mentions of your brand or social media mentions and so on. So this is, I work with databases, so this is a report I always follow from 451 Research. They I don't know if they download LinkedIn data or if you can just query LinkedIn and get these numbers. I think it's the latter. And they just count how many LinkedIn users mention that they have experience with a certain database product. And then you can see that one has more than the other. Of course, this does not mean that in the world there are 95,000 MongoDB users and 30,000 Cassandra users and so on. So this is just like a sample of the world, which is LinkedIn user base. But you can still follow the trend. So are we at least growing? How much are we growing? Are we bigger than somebody else? And so on. So So in that sense, you can use this as a proxy measure to follow adoption. And of course, since revenue is adoption times conversion ratio, we absolutely want to know how we are doing with adoption, even if we cannot know the real answer, which we will never find out. Right. So conclusion: adoption is the most important one of these metrics. You can always, get some press releases out and get more awareness. It doesn't necessarily convert into sales. So adoption is important, but it's also the most difficult one to measure. So finally, I would like to go through this same discussion to compare with traditional software sales, just because that might be one way to understand that there's something we are familiar with, maybe if we have experience with that. So how is this different that I have just explained? Right? So in traditionally software sales for closed source, actually the funnel looks different. So you start with marketing to create awareness, then you try to collect leads, somehow get contact with people, and you contact these people, and the main objective of this process is to convert them to using your product, after which they have to pay. Or there is piracy, but then you can kind of hunt them down and force them to pay. So the logic of the sales funnel is different, right? So in proprietary software, you spend a lot of sales effort to convince people to use your product, and you might help them and give them free consulting to complete a pilot project and so on, because once you are done, you just get the money. In open source, you spend most of your effort to convince your already existing users to pay for your software. In proprietary software, the sales cycle might be long, 6 to 12 months easily, and expensive. You might give a lot of free consulting. But in open source, the key objective of the whole sales process is to keep the sales cycle short and efficient, because it's easy to get thousands of leads for an open source company, and then you can waste your time talking to them on the phone and you will not get any money out of them. So the whole point is to be efficient with lead qualification. And in the best case, we had I live in Finland. We had a case last year. Somebody, actually a well-known company, we had sold to them other database projects in our past lives, database products, and now they called us and said, hey, we have a new project or a new product line, several products. We have done some evaluation and we have chosen MongoDB. We are in a hurry, we need to start with, we need training and consulting and we need help. And we closed a €100,000 deal in less than 2 weeks. And then in the next quarter, we sold an even more subscriptions. So this is an efficient sales cycle, kind of a best case scenario. Maybe a smaller deal you can just do in a day. Somebody calls you, say, hey, we are in production, something is wrong, we need help. We can help you if you pay. This happens. So that is what you want to see in the best case. And it's the benefit of open source. Of course, with closed source, it doesn't happen that we kind of already are using your software, even if we shouldn't, but now we would like to pay. So this is the point of the open source sales model. Final note, in proprietary software pricing, and this sounds like terrible, but this is how everybody does it. Pricing is a function of migration cost. So if you have been using Oracle sales rep will think, how much money can I squeeze out of you before you start migrating to Microsoft or Enterprise DB? And they will kind of stop just before they go too far to trigger you to migrate. And that can be a lot of money because database migrations are expensive, especially if you are locked in with a lot of store procedures. In open source, a customer can use your product and just choose not to pay. So the pricing often reflects the value of whatever you are offering the subscription, like support and consulting and maybe some extra features, but not the value of the open source product, which they could use without paying. So there is kind of a related side note, which is good to pay attention to. In open source, if you see people migrating away from your product, this means something is wrong with the product. It is not because it's too expensive, right? So this is good to keep you honest, because with other products, migrations might happen for all kinds of reasons. In open source, you never have this reason. So, final conclusion, to repeat what we have learned. In open source, your conversion ratio is tiny. It's way below 1% in any case. Also, prices are lower than with closed source software. So now you might be wondering, why would anybody want to even be selling open source? So this must be offset by the benefits of open source. You can get massive adoption. Easily you can have more than 1,000 times more users compared to what a closed source business would have. If we would go back to that list of most popular most popular NoSQL databases, out of the top 10, 8 of them are open source. And the biggest closed source one now in 2015 is DynamoDB. So Amazon is kind of big and they have some benefits there. And then the first really closed source database that you can use outside of Amazon is MarkLogic, and it's going downward. And they are certainly, I don't know if they are 1,000 times smaller than the leading ones, but certainly there is a benefit in much bigger adoption by being open source. So this could alone offset the negative problems with the low conversion ratio, because you simply have so many more users. So the net result is still good. You need to focus on creating an efficient sales cycle. Don't waste time on the people who will not become paying customers. And in some cases, then you have the shared R&D as investment. So this again offsets. So you might have actually less sales, but you also have lesser R&D investment. I would like to thank my boss, Joe Morrissey, because this is being recorded. He has been my boss both at MongoDB and MySQL, so I have learned most of what I know about sales in those jobs, and he actually encouraged me to write a few blog posts that then became this OSCON talk. And I suppose I'm open for questions. How much time do we have? 5-10 minutes? Yeah. Any questions? Yes.
So one question is about the charity models of open source software. So what are
Charity model.
charity models?
Right, so charity models in open source software, that's an interesting thing. This week I have met two persons who, one was, well, you saw Paul Fenwick this morning, who is a Perl guy, and he has a crowdfunding project, Kickstarter or something similar, for writing some Perl-related software. And it doesn't pay his full salary, but he's kind of happy with the fact that he can spend a lot of his time just improving this open source project. And I met Katie, who works full-time as a Drupal contributor, and she's paid by some hosting companies who sponsor her 1 year at a time or so. She has had a couple of sponsors. So I think that's very positive development that this happens, but it's not really like a business model. They will never get rich doing this, and it's only a handful of people even who can get these kind of positions. So I mentioned, I think on one of these slides in lead qualification, somewhere here. Charity. Yes, so sometimes when working for, this happened both in MySQL and MongoDB, it doesn't happen often, but sometimes when selling for a for-profit company, you talk to a lead who says, we really love open source, and we would like to pay because we really love your product. So the sales guy's like, great, finally somebody understands what it is all about. And this is a bad lead, right? So these people typically is not a high decision maker who can spend like 100,000 or 500,000. So what he is thinking is that I would pay you like maybe 5,000 euros and you will send a consultant here for a few days and we will have a nice time. But this is not what the sales rep wants to sell him, because maybe they are using like 20 servers or 50 units of what you want to sell him, because they are of course big. If he likes you so much, he's quite a big user of your product. So I have never seen good deals coming out of these leads. However, you can use this goodwill. So you should not sell your product to this guy. You should say, I want to talk to your manager who has bigger budget, and then this guy will be a good advocate for, saying, this is a really critical product in our infrastructure, and we could really benefit from their help. And you don't mention the money to this guy who doesn't have any, and then you can get more money out of his manager. Okay. All right. Yes.
So I understand the qualifier. These are really good.
Okay. Thank you.
Find that nugget out of the 1,000, right? Then how do you grow the other number? How do you get more users?
More users. Oh yes, good point. So increase adoption. Marketing could help. Do meetups, talk at conferences, sponsor O'Reilly conferences. That's a great way. And like I said, sometimes maybe you can add something to your product. Like also you might be able to enter some new market segment. So in MySQL case, for example, it was the LAMP stack, so it was very popular for web, but it was not really in like the enterprise world. Everybody's using Oracle, and the idea that they could use an open source database was kind of crazy and irresponsible. So MySQL spent a lot of effort trying to get there and being more compliant with the SQL standard and so on. And the other thing, of course, is that also those traditional enterprises had more money. So MySQL was also trying to move into a customer segment who can pay more, right? So that's one example. Yeah, actually it was two things, both of, at least the first one was quite unexpected. So they spent a lot of effort adding SQL features from the SQL standard, because that's like a checkbox that you needed to have, and maybe like authentication and so on you need to have. And with MongoDB we've done the same process. So we have a lot of customers, banks and insurance companies on Wall Street, and they gave us like a long list that you need to have encryption, authentication, blah blah blah, auditing, all kinds of government regulations require us to do this or that. We really love your product, but you have to do all of this, then you can go into production in a bank. And we have done that. When I came to the company, they finished the last iteration of that list. So that was one thing. But in MySQL times, MySQL was simply too early. This didn't really matter. MySQL simply wasn't a credible database, but they had acquired from Ericsson a product which was then named to MySQL Cluster, which was a different database engine and was kind of telco grade, high availability, high performance. And they managed to sell that to, I think, first to a company in Italy, and then finally to Alcatel in France, which is a big telco company, then to Nokia, then to Ericsson, Huawei, and a lot of like Verizon, Orange, and so on. And they sold this way, so typical MySQL subscription was like $1,000, $2,000, and the premium one was $5,000. And MySQL Cluster was like $10,000 per CPU. So it was almost like Oracle pricing, but it was actually better than Oracle for telco-specific applications. And this was of course kind of a niche business, but at least it was good margins. But this also then gave credibility, because finally we had these logos that Orange is using, and what is this other company in Europe? Vodafone. Right, so you get these big logos, and suddenly you have much more credibility selling to other traditional companies. Then of course MySQL was acquired by Sun, and this changed everything. So suddenly we had like $1 million deals everywhere, because the Sun rep who you would trust introduced us to the customer. And the customers were thinking, well, now this is not like some small open source startup, this is big corporation, nothing bad can ever happen to Sun, so we will invest a lot of money in it. And then a year later, the game was over. So that was kind of odd. But this is how the customer's mind works.
Thank
Are we done? Thanks a lot for coming. I really enjoy these business topics.